Supposedly, when supply goes up, prices go down. But that doesn't seem to be the case in Ontario's electricity market. The province regularly exports surplus electricity to various utilities in Quebec and the United States at a discounted price. This while Ontario manufacturers pay 4 to 5 times more for their power usage. Joining us now for more on this power pay, Jatin Nathwani. He is Ontario Research Chair in Public Policy and Sustainable Energy Management at the University of Waterloo, and we're glad you could make the trip along the 401 for us here today to TVO.
My pleasure.
I want to just read something to start with here that Barry McKenna wrote in the Globe and Mail last month, and it'll just set up the discussion to come here. Here he goes. He says, the laws of economics suggest that when supply goes up, prices fall. Not so in Ontario's increasingly twisted electricity market. Here, heavily discounted surplus power is routinely sold to neighboring utilities in Quebec and various U.S. states, while customers at home face a steady diet of higher rates. Ontario had net exports of more than 1,000 megawatts of electricity last year, or enough to power 1 million homes. Occasionally, the Ontario Power Authority even pays Hydro-Quebec to take electricity off its hands. Power the Quebec utility can then resell in New England at a profit. Okay, it doesn't sound as if the normal rules of supply and demand work here. How come?
Well, it goes to the heart of the architecture of the way we have designed our markets, the way we operate this sector, and he has, in essence, gotten at the truth of the complexity of what we have set up.
So you agree with everything he's written here?
He has, the essence of the truth is all in there, and I think he's got it about right. But to unpack this, I think we need to see what is underlying all this, and maybe if I can make a few comments. We are beginning to see, for example, impacts on cost of electricity, big concern. And you might ask, why is that the case? I would put one in one set of buckets, which you might call the facts of life. And the other is a whole host of policy prescriptions, poor governance, and almost willful denial of any principle that you might call tests of prudence around economic prudence. We seem to have ignored that. And the genesis of all that is essentially the Green Energy Act that was brought in a hurry.
More on that in a second. But let me just help me with the basic understanding here of, I mean, everybody understands supply and demand. You got more supply, prices are supposed to go down.
Right.
You got less supply, prices are supposed to go up.
Right.
Why are we giving power away, or if we have so much supply?
It has to do with when that power is produced. So that is part of the problem. We have, for example, what is called low load conditions, less demand on the power system at 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. in the morning. And at that time, we have a huge amount of wind generation, for example. And what you then need to do, and the contractual construct is that you have to accept and absorb that wind generation into the system, no matter what the demand is. So what that pushes is a pressure on the prices are low at that time, and excess demand. So what do? We put that power. You can either curtail the wind, which you don't have the desire to do or cannot do by contractual arrangements, and so we have excess power that ends up being sold, or almost. We've seen negative pricing regimes as a result of that kind of a weird, strange system that we're operating.
Negative pricing regime means what?
You're paying people to take the power away.
We pay others to take our power.
It does sound very counterintuitive, but that has happened a few times here in Ontario within the last 12 months.
Tell me this then, why, if we have this excess power, are we selling it to Quebec at a cheap price to take it off our hands, and then they flip it to American states and make a profit on it? Why aren't we just selling it to the Americans and making a profit on it?
And that goes to the question of the ability or inability to store the power when it is produced. So it's time arbitrage, really. If you're not able to store that excess power at 2 in the morning or 3 in the morning, it goes up. And then at 4 in the afternoon, when you need that power and when there's a market for it, the person who is storing that power, in this case happens to be Quebec, can say, oh, I got a good market down in the United States. This is where it goes. And so that's the awkward construct, let's call it.
And why can't we store it?
We have some capacity for storage in Ontario, but not enough.
Not enough capacity.
For storage.
Would it make sense for us to increase the ability to have this capacity?
In fact, that has emerged as one of the most important learnings, if you wish, as we're beginning to see a larger amount of renewable energy generation within the mix. And so therefore, and if it appears at the wrong time, the ability to store at scale would be a key benefit if you are able to do that in Ontario. So then you can do, in essence, what Quebec is doing, but do it here in Ontario.
Okay, one more thing on this, and that is that we're paying a lot more for power today than we ever used to, for electricity. And if there's so much excess, why are we still paying such high prices for electricity when theoretically, again, more supply, prices go down. Yeah. Less supply, prices go up. There's lots of supply. So why are we paying more?
Well, it is because some of this excess arises as part of the contractual arrangements and the stipulations of the Green Energy Act. So if you have large amounts of wind generation or solar generation, and for that matter nuclear as well, is part of the contractual arrangements. And if you cannot back off that, so if all wind that is produced has to be put on the system, whether you need it or not, and it gets paid the price that is part of the feed-in tariff arrangement. And that's a high-cost arrangement, and that's where the cost pressures are beginning to surface because of just the way the feed-in tariff system works.
Okay. There's one of those expressions that I hate energy people for using.
I know.
Feed-in tariff. But essentially, they create the power, they feed it into
the system,
and then the system goes out, and they're paid a big surplus beyond what it costs to make that power in order to create it, because it's green.
Absolutely correct. Yeah.
Okay, and that's basically part of the Green Energy Act that the previous Dalton McGuinty government created.
Yeah, and to give you a sense of the perspective, let's say average power production cost in Ontario on average 6 cents a kilowatt hour for the sake of discussion. If you have a certain amount of wind generation, you're going to pay 12, 13, 14 cents a kilo. So it's twice the cost. And then solar is perhaps 10 times the cost. So that's where the cost pressure begins to surface.
But this is where I don't understand that. We're 50% reliant on nuclear here.
Right.
Wind and solar is that much of our split, right?
Right.
So how does this much end up costing that much more?
Well, in the early days, it was less so, but that pressure is now beginning to build up as more and more wind generation begins to enter the system. So the estimates actually of the excess costs, or call them subsidies if you wish, arising from this higher cost generation are now beginning to turn into $1 billion plus a year, and as you look ahead, it'll be $1.5 billion plus every year cost embedded within the system as more and more of this renewable generation comes to. So 5 years ago, you could say it was a small proportion. It is continuing to increase, and more so as we go down.
But what is it now? Solar and wind now is what?
Well, it's 1,800 megawatts for wind and 300 or 400 for solar.
And it's a percentage of the power we create? How much is that?
Well, on a 30,000 system, it's still a small proportion.
Exactly. So how does, it's the same question again though. How does something that represents, I mean, it's less than 10% of our energy consumption mix right now.
Right.
So how does that turn into billions of dollars?
That's the forecast for where we're going. The next 3,800 megawatts of wind, the IESO estimates are that we will get 3,800 megawatts of new wind generation within the next 18 months on top of the 1,700. And so that begins to get into a situation of
you're barely over 10% there, though.
But it is high cost power that you have to absorb, and then you have to scale back others if the demand is low.
Okay. Well, you understand the principle of the Green Energy Act. I mean, I remember Dalton McGuinty was sitting in that chair, and he said, look, one of the jobs that I have is to pick a lane. That was the expression he used. And the lane I'm picking is I want Ontario to be the #1 green energy manufacturing jurisdiction in all of North America. And so he said he was prepared to subsidize this nascent wind and solar industry to get it off the ground, to get it strong, and then when it was in a good position, he'd start to bring the subsidies down. That's, I guess, part of the philosophy behind the Green Energy Act. Yeah. What's wrong with that?
Well, there is a rational and a reasonable argument for economic development objectives, if you wish, and to use perhaps the investment in the energy sector as an argument for trying to promote cleaner, greener, renewable energy resources. One could say that's a reasonable proposition. It is, I believe, I characterize it as kind of a race to green energy on steroids, if you wish. Literally turbocharged levels of tariffs, and we just talked about it, 10 times for solar, 2-3 times for wind. Bioenergy is in between.
But not forever, just for now.
Well, that was the idea is if you're able to decouple and actually have decreases over time, that would work. But that was not really the early part of what we saw. And so that's now embedded a fair bit of cost pressure already arising from the feed-in tariffs. The other thing you have to realize is that beyond the tariffs and the higher costs associated with these tariffs, and one could argue it could be a little lower in the future, and those adjustments are continuing to be made within the structure, there are other additional costs that arise. So if you say because the distribution utilities and the power sector has to absorb this power, distributed, dispersed, wherever it is, you need to have the infrastructure in place to be able to do so, right? And there's some cost associated with it. And that's an indirect cost, you could argue. But because there's an obligation to accommodate these dispersed resources, it shows up on the footstep of the distribution utility, who then go to the regulator and say our rates have to increase because now we need to accommodate this part of the generation. So it's a general upward pressure from a number of other factors. I'd said earlier that what we call facts of life kind of increases that are embedded in here. The system is old. There is that infrastructure continues to be renewed and needs to be renewed, both on the generation side as well as the transmission and distribution side. So this is like your roof needs replacement, if you wish, and new roof is always going to cost you a little more than less. And so that's where the other pressures come from. But those are facts of life. Beyond that, we have the Green Energy Act, the stipulations of the feed-in tariff, and so on.
Let me follow up on Green Energy Act again. Yeah. I know you're not a fan of it. But and again, this, I guess, we make the comparison here to Obamacare, what's going on in the States. It's one thing to discuss it as a policy idea. It's another thing to discuss it as something you need to implement. Obviously, their implementation down there has been terrible. Yeah. So separate for me your chief criticisms. Is it a criticism of the policy itself of the Green Energy Act, or you just don't like the way it's been brought in?
I think the latter. It's the way it was brought in. Too much enthusiasm, not enough thought given to cost implications and otherwise. And if you ask me, and I would like to say that I'm not against the Green Energy Act. I think the good intentions and the ideas behind it are actually not bad, because you see, we've decided to get out of coal, so we're going to have to replace this, and we do want to get on to a future which has a cleaner, greener environment, let's call it. But it is the way we designed it, and we designed it in a way that you set a very high price. You could have, and let's assume for new technologies, you don't know the price, and you need some sort of the market to do price discovery, if you wish. Mm-hmm. One could have said, okay, we'll give you 80 cents per kilowatt hour for solar, very high, we don't know where the price point is.
Which they did for a while.
But you could have said, the next 500 megawatts at that cost. So now you at least contain your exposure, if you wish, to that risk. And then you could say call it reverse auction, if you wish, to say, all right, the next 500 after the 2 years would be at 60 cents. And you could go down to then begin to get a sense of what the competitive markets will deliver.
They never did say that at the beginning, did they?
So what we should have done is put into it certain markers, if you wish, that would promote innovation, that would create competition amongst different sources, green, let's call it, wind, solar, bioenergy, and so on, and find price points in a competitive market that will enable. So a more measured approach, a little more thought to how we could have implemented it, would have prevented some of the issues and problems.
Okay, a few minutes left here. I want to tackle a couple of more things. You'll remember back in May, the World Trade Organization said, Ontario, you are improperly favoring locals in your green energy situation, and it's against the rules of the WTO, and you can't do it anymore. And I wonder if you could tell us how you think that ruling has had an impact on the efforts to make this province greener.
Well, it was expected something like that would come, because whenever you have a poor policy formulation, you can expect something like that. Other countries do it in different disguises, other provinces do it in different disguises. It's just the way things work. And unfortunately, it landed against the Ontario. And so it has had a damper, I think, in terms of the enthusiasm that it came at it from another angle. In fact, the World Trade Organization ruling, I believe it was Japan and one or two other countries that went after that. So it has had some impact, I think.
Does it hamstring our local manufacturers to do better?
I would like to think that it should provide the spur or the desire, if you wish, to do better in terms of not having to rely on that fraction of home production, but just be competitive enough so that you can provide it at home or be someplace else.
Okay. In our last minute here, then, let's tackle this. I appreciate your criticisms about how we got to where we are, but let's face it, we are where we are.
That's right.
So going forward, what do you think we should be doing?
Well, we should continue to support the transition to a greener, cleaner energy system. We should continue to allow a mix of the supply system to evolve in a much more measured way. We should ensure, I mentioned earlier, the undoing, if you wish, of the governance architecture. The regulator had no say whatsoever in how some of these ministerial directives translated into contractual arrangements that became what we got. So if you take an economic regulator who has the obligation to look after the consumer's interest, if you factor him out of that equation, you're going to land in trouble, and that's about where we got. So why would we not subject any green proposition to the same level of scrutiny that for any other conventional generation, that the regulator would look at and arbitrate on what are reasonable costs and what are not, and try to promote it that way?
Have you made these views known to the Ministry of Energy?
I have.
What do they say?
Whenever the opportunities have come, I've done some of these things in writing as well as part of my feedback to the long-term energy plan. So thank you for your feedback.
So it's just thank you, but we're not necessarily going to do it?
Well, all you can do is make your points.
You propose, they dispose. That's the way it works. That's true. That's Jatin Nathwani, and thanks for coming in from the University of Waterloo tonight to help us out with this. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Steve.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.